For most of history, money was simple. If you held it in your hand, it meant something real stood behind it. Gold, silver, something that existed even if governments collapsed. For Americans, this belief was so deeply ingrained that nobody questioned it. A dollar was a promise, and a promise was supposed to be permanent. In the early 1900s, if you walked into a bank with paper dollars, the teller didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They handed you gold. Not because they trusted you, but because the system forced them to. Every dollar printed had a shadow behind it. A shadow made of metal, heavy, finite, unforgiving, and that shadow kept everyone honest. Governments couldn't print endlessly. Banks couldn't gamble too far, and politicians couldn't buy votes with imaginary money. Because gold doesn't lie. Then came wars. World War I cracked the system, World War II shattered it. To fight global wars, America needed money faster than gold could allow. So the rules bent. Temporarily, they said. After World War II, the United States emerged as the last man standing. Europe was destroyed. Factories burned. Currencies collapsed. America had the gold. America had the power. So the world made a deal. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, countries agreed. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold. $1.35 for 1 ounce. Simple, elegant, dangerous, because now the entire world trusted one promise, and that promise was made by politicians. At first, it worked. America rebuilt Europe. Factories boomed. The middle class exploded. One income bought a house, a car, and a future. People believed the system was fair. But behind the scenes, the math was breaking. The US was printing more dollars than it had gold. Foreign countries noticed. France noticed first. In the 1960s, French ships began arriving in New York, not for trade, for gold. France demanded physical gold in exchange for its dollars. Other countries followed. America's gold vaults began to drain. And suddenly, the truth became obvious. There wasn't enough gold for all those dollars. The promise was a lie. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon faced a choice. Tell the truth and collapse the system, or quietly change reality. On a Sunday night, when markets were closed and people were distracted, Nixon went on television.com Voice. Serious face. He announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. Temporary. That word mattered, because temporary things feel safe. But that night, something permanent happened. The dollar stopped being real money. No vote, no referendum, no public debate, just a sentence on television. From that moment on, the dollar was backed by nothing but belief. And belief is fragile. People didn't panic immediately. Life went on, but the rules of reality had changed. Money could now be created without limits. Debt no longer needed an anchor. And inflation was no longer an accident, it became policy. The 1970s felt chaotic for a reason. Prices rose, wages lagged, oil shocks hit, people blamed gas stations, corporations, foreign countries, but the real cause was invisible. Money itself had changed. The dollar was no longer a store of value. It was a tool that rewarded those closest to its creation. Banks, governments, financial institutions. Everyone else paid later. And most Americans never realized the deal had been rewritten. They kept saving, kept working harder, kept believing productivity would make them rich. But something was off. Despite working more hours, families needed 2 incomes. Despite higher education, debt exploded. Despite record productivity, wages stagnated. It wasn't bad luck, it was design. Because when money is created from nothing, it flows unevenly. Those who receive it first benefit. Those who receive it last pay the price. This hidden cost had a name: inflation. But inflation wasn't just higher prices. It was time theft. It was silent confiscation. It was an invisible tax. And it hit savers the hardest. The people who followed the rules. The people who trusted the system. And as decades passed, the gap widened. Assets soared. Stocks, real estate, but wages crawled. Owning things became more important than making things. Speculation beat labor. And most people couldn't explain why. They just felt poorer. By the time the internet age arrived, money had become almost completely abstract. Numbers on screens, digits in databases. No weight, no limit, and the system learned a dangerous trick. Whenever something broke, it printed. .com crash. Print 2008 financial crisis. Print more. Pandemic. Print everything. Each time, the solution was the same: create money, delay pain, promise stability. But pain doesn't disappear, it compounds, and eventually, it comes due. By the 2020s, Americans began to feel it everywhere: groceries, rent, healthcare. They were told inflation was temporary, again, but deep down, something felt different, because the dollar hadn't been real money for decades. And now, the consequences were unavoidable. The moment Nixon closed the gold window wasn't just economic, it was psychological. It taught governments that limits were optional. It taught markets that risk would be rescued. It taught citizens that saving was foolish. And once people stop believing money is real, they start chasing anything that feels solid. Stocks, houses, crypto, anything. Not to get rich, but to avoid getting poorer. And that fear, that quiet, unspoken fear, is what truly defines the modern American economy. Because once money stops being real, people stop trusting the future. After 1971, the dollar didn't collapse, it transformed. And transformations are dangerous because they don't feel like disasters, they feel like progress. Credit cards exploded, loans became easy, debt became normal. At first it felt empowering. You didn't need to wait anymore. You didn't need to save, you could buy now and pay later. And Americans loved it. Homes grew larger, cars became status symbols, consumption replaced restraint. But beneath the surface, something subtle was happening. Wages stopped keeping up. In the decades after the gold standard ended, productivity soared. Workers produced more than ever before. Technology made everything faster, cheaper, more efficient. But the rewards didn't go to labor. They went to capital. They went to asset owners. They went to those closest to newly created money. This wasn't an accident. It was the natural outcome of a system without limits. When money is tied to something real, it forces discipline. When money is unlimited, discipline disappears. Governments learned they could promise everything. Banks learned they could take extreme risks. Corporations learned they could borrow endlessly to buy back their own stock. And every time something broke, the solution was the same: print. The 1987 crash, liquidity, the dot-com bubble, lower rates, the housing collapse in 2008, trillions. Each rescue taught the same lesson: risk is rewarded, failure is optional, consequences are negotiable. This created a generation of markets addicted to cheap money, and addictions always escalate. By the time the 2010s arrived, the system could no longer function normally. Interest rates near zero became permanent. Debt became astronomical, and the idea of sound money was treated like a joke. People were told not to worry. Inflation was under control. The system was stable. Experts had it handled. But stability was an illusion. Because stability built on debt is fragile. And fragile systems fear one thing above all else: rising rates. If interest rates rise, debt becomes expensive. If debt becomes expensive, bubbles pop. If bubbles pop, trust disappears. So rates stayed low, artificially low, and the cost was hidden in plain sight. Savings accounts paid nothing. Pensions struggled. Retirements became market dependent. The responsible were punished. The reckless were rewarded. This inverted morality wasn't a glitch. It was a feature, because fiat systems don't reward virtue. They reward access. Access to credit, access to leverage, access to political influence. And slowly, quietly, inequality widened. Not because people stopped working, but because the rules changed. Owning assets mattered more than producing value. Speculation mattered more than innovation. A stock market detached from reality became the scoreboard of success. And politicians celebrated rising indexes as proof the economy was healthy, even as ordinary people felt poorer. Then came the moment the illusion cracked. The pandemic. In response to crisis, governments didn't hesitate. They printed money at a scale never seen before in human history. Not billions, not trillions, but numbers so large they stopped meaning anything. Stimulus checks, emergency programs, corporate bailouts. Money flooded the system. And for a brief moment, it felt like magic. Markets soared, assets exploded. People felt rich on paper. But paper wealth isn't real wealth. And inflation doesn't arrive immediately. It waits. It seeps. It spreads. By the time prices began rising sharply, the damage was already done. Groceries doubled. Rent exploded. Energy costs surged. And suddenly, people noticed. Not economists. Not analysts. Regular people. The ones who don't read CPI reports, the ones who don't care about monetary policy. They just knew something was wrong. They worked the same hours. They earned similar wages. But life cost more. Much more. And the explanations sounded hollow. Supply chains. Temporary shocks. Corporate greed. Those were symptoms, not causes. The cause was decades old. The moment the dollar stopped being real money, inflation stopped being an accident. It became inevitable. Because when money is unlimited, prices must eventually adjust to reality, and reality is finite. This is when trust began to fracture. People stopped believing official numbers, stopped believing reassurances, stopped believing promises. They felt it in their daily lives. And when trust breaks, behavior changes. People stopped saving. They chased assets. They speculated out of fear, not greed. Stocks, crypto, real estate, anything that felt more real than cash, because cash was melting. This wasn't irrational, it was survival. Fiat money forces everyone to become an investor, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. And this is the cruelest part of the system. It turns stability into risk. A teacher saving for retirement must compete with hedge funds. A factory worker must understand markets just to preserve purchasing power. Failure becomes personal, even though the cause is systemic, and governments respond the same way every time. By controlling narratives, they redefine inflation, they adjust measurements, they downplay discomfort, because admitting the truth would expose the foundation. That money no longer represents stored value. It represents political decisions, and political decisions change quickly. The dollar today isn't backed by gold. It isn't backed by productivity. It's backed by confidence. Confidence that the system will continue. Confidence that debt can grow forever. Confidence that someone else will pay later. But history is ruthless with confidence-based systems. Every fiat currency ends the same way. Not necessarily with hyperinflation. Not necessarily with collapse. But with loss of faith. People stop asking, how much is this worth? And start asking, how long before it's worth less? That question changes everything. It accelerates spending, encourages speculation, punishes patience, and once that mindset spreads, it cannot be reversed. Because trust, once broken, never fully heals. This is where America stands today, not at the end, but deep into the consequences. The dollar still functions, transactions still occur, markets still open, but the belief that money equals value is gone. People feel it instinctively. That's why conversations about rigged systems have gone mainstream. That's why institutions are questioned. That's why the future feels uncertain. It's not cultural, it's monetary. The moment the dollar stopped being real money, time itself changed. The future was pulled forward, borrowed, spent, and now, the bill is arriving, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. And the most unsettling truth is this. There is no easy fix. You cannot print trust. You cannot legislate value. You cannot promise your way out of reality. The system will continue until it can't, and when it changes, it won't be announced on television. Just like before, it will happen quietly. In policy rooms, in balance sheets, in overnight decisions. And most people won't realize it until years later. They'll just feel that something fundamental shifted. Again, because the dollar didn't stop being real money in 1971, that was just the beginning. The real ending hasn't happened yet.